The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel shimmered like a field of gold beneath the chandeliers, every crystal reflecting wealth, power, and the kind of smiles people wore when they wanted to be seen. Along the grand staircase, Camille Mercer descended slowly in a silver gown that caught the light with every step. A Cartier bracelet flashed at her wrist. Cameras turned. Guests whispered. More than one society columnist had already begun calling her the future Mrs. Grant Wren, and Grant did nothing to stop them. Standing near the center of the room in a black tuxedo tailored to perfection, he accepted handshakes, compliments, and praise for another record-breaking year of philanthropy. He looked polished, untouchable, every inch the billionaire Manhattan admired. Camille slipped beside him as if she already belonged there, her red lips curved in a small, victorious smile. "Beautiful entrance," one donor said. Camille laughed softly. "Tonight matters to me more than you know." At the far end of the ballroom, members of the board exchanged careful glances but said nothing. A string quartet played near the stage. Champagne glittered in tall glasses. The charity's name shone across a screen in elegant gold script. Everything had been arranged to project grace, generosity, and control. Then the doors opened. The cold from Fifth Avenue slipped into the room first. After it came Savannah Pierce. For one suspended second, no one moved. She wore black, no diamonds, no dramatic train, no desperate smile. Her dark hair was swept back neatly, and her face held the calm stillness of a woman who had already cried every tear she would ever give this room. After nearly a year of silence, she had returned to the exact place where society had quietly buried her. Camille's smile faltered. Grant turned, and for the first time that night, the color left his face. Savannah stepped forward with quiet elegance, neither hurried nor hesitant. Before anyone could speak, Judith Holloway crossed the floor, stopped in front of her, and said in a clear voice that carried farther than the music, "Welcome back, Ms. Pierce. The foundation has been waiting for its true founder." Across the ballroom, Camille's champagne glass trembled in her hand. 11 months earlier, Savannah Pierce Wren still believed silence could save a marriage. From the outside, her life looked flawless. Their penthouse above Central Park was featured twice in luxury magazines. A black Mercedes waited downstairs every morning. The doorman greeted her by name. Their calendar was full of gallery dinners, charity previews, investor lunches, and weekends in the Hamptons that looked perfect in photographs. To Manhattan, Savannah and Grant Wren were more than married. They were a brand, but brands hide decay better than people. That winter, Grant began changing in ways so small they almost escaped notice. First, he stopped lingering over breakfast, and then he started answering emails during dinner, his eyes fixed on his iPhone, while Savannah's words dissolved into the air between them. When she asked if something was wrong, he would reach for her hand without looking at her and say the same thing every time. "Just pressure. It'll pass." She wanted to believe him. She had stood beside Grant before he became the Grant Wren people fought to impress. She remembered the cheaper apartments, the nights he couldn't sleep before major deals, the old MacBook they shared at the kitchen table while she edited his investor presentations line by line. She knew his ambition, she knew his moods, so when he grew distant, she told herself this was exhaustion, not betrayal. But then came the exclusions. Meetings she had once helped prepare for were suddenly handled already. Donor calls were moved without her knowledge. A spring planning session for the foundation was held on Park Avenue, while she sat at home waiting for the briefing file that never came. When she asked his assistant about it, the young woman sounded nervous and said, "Mr. Wren thought it would be easier if Camille covered communications. Camille. The name landed quietly, but not softly. Savannah had heard it before. Camille Mercer. Young, polished, camera-ready. Hired 6 months earlier to modernize the Foundation's public image. Grant had described her as efficient, nothing more. But now Savannah noticed how often that name floated through the apartment, through emails, through passing remarks made by board members who suddenly spoke as if Camille had always been there. Still, Savannah said nothing. That was her first mistake. Because while she was protecting the dignity of her marriage, someone else was already learning how to step into her place, smile in her direction, and slowly erase her from the room before she even realized she was disappearing. Savannah Pierce Wren had never wanted to be the face of anything. That was one of the reasons Grant fell in love with her in the first place. In a city full of people desperate to be photographed, Savannah was the rare woman who knew how to build something meaningful without stepping in front of it. She understood rooms, power, timing, and the fragile pride of wealthy men. More importantly, she understood Grant long before Manhattan decided he was worth admiring. Years earlier, when his first hotel acquisition nearly collapsed, it was Savannah who stayed up until 3 a.m. beside him, editing investor letters on an aging MacBook while takeout containers crowded the kitchen counter. When a donor's wife felt ignored at a private dinner, Savannah was the one who remembered her charity work, her late mother's name, and the exact school where she funded scholarships. The next week, that couple invested $2 million. Grant got the headlines. Savannah built the trust behind them. The foundation that now carried the Wren name had started with her idea after a visit to a pediatric cancer floor downtown. She had stood in that hospital hallway watching parents try to smile through fear, told Grant that money meant nothing if it never reached the people whose lives could change because of it. He had kissed her forehead and called her the conscience of his empire. For a while, he meant it. Savannah wrote thank you notes by hand with her father's old Mont Blanc pen. She planned donor luncheons, reviewed speeches, corrected budgets, and quietly made sure promises became action. She knew which board member hated being rushed, which family preferred privacy, which reporter could be trusted with a sensitive story. She wasn't decoration, she was structure. But structure is easy to forget once the building stands. As Grant's success hardened into power, people began speaking to Savannah differently. They called her elegant, gracious, lovely. Words that sounded flattering until she realized they were replacing smarter ones. Strategic, essential, founding. She watched men thank Grant for visions she had shaped with him in silence. And the cruelest part was that Savannah let it happen because love made her believe recognition inside a marriage mattered more than recognition outside it. She did not yet understand that the moment a woman allows her work to be renamed as devotion, someone colder, younger, and hungrier can walk into the story and claim she was never the reason it stood at all. By spring, Camille was no longer just attending foundation meetings. She was speaking in Savannah's place. Camille Mercer did not arrive in Savannah's life like a scandal. She arrived like a solution. At first, that was what made her dangerous. She never crossed obvious lines. She never flirted where anyone important could see it. She never challenged Savannah directly. Instead, she stepped into the foundation with polished manners, a soft voice, and the kind of calm competence that made busy people grateful. She was introduced as a communications consultant, someone young enough to understand social media, but polished enough to survive old money rooms without embarrassing anyone. Savannah almost liked her. Camille knew how to lower her eyes at the right moment, how to praise Grant without sounding obvious, and how to ask Savannah for advice in a way that seemed respectful. She sent thoughtful follow-up emails. She remembered names. She once arrived at a children's hospital event carrying extra scarves for volunteers because the weather had turned unexpectedly cold. Even Judith admitted she seemed prepared, but perfection is unsettling when it appears too quickly. The first moment Savannah felt it was after a donor dinner on Fifth Avenue. Grant slid into the back of the car beside Camille to continue a conversation about messaging strategy, while Savannah sat across from them. It was a small thing, innocent even, yet Camille knew exactly how Grant took his bourbon. She knew he hated being handed briefing notes before dessert. She even laughed at a story he had told only once before, privately, in their kitchen years ago. Savannah looked out at the Manhattan lights and said nothing. Then came the copying. Camille began wearing muted silk dresses in the same tones Savannah preferred. Her hair changed, softer, darker, more classic. At one spring luncheon, she used a phrase Savannah had once written into Grant's speech, almost word for word. Giving should restore dignity, not just provide relief. The board members nodded, impressed. Grant didn't react, or maybe he chose not to. That was worse. Savannah started noticing how often Camille found reasons to stand at Grant's shoulder, how naturally photographers framed them together, how easily other people accepted the image. Nothing was ever inappropriate enough to name. That was Camille's gift. She understood that in powerful circles, replacement never begins with open theft. It begins with imitation, and imitation becomes invasion when the right people decide it is convenient. One afternoon, Savannah walked into the foundation office and found Camille seated in her usual chair at the conference table, reviewing next quarter's donor schedule as if she had every right to be there. Then Camille looked up, smiled sweetly, and said, "Oh, I hope you don't mind. Everyone said this seat made the most sense for me now." For the first time, Savannah realized this woman was not trying to impress her. She was trying to erase her. The first public wound came wrapped in candlelight, violin music, and polite laughter. It happened at a private donor dinner at the River Cafe, where the windows framed the Manhattan skyline like a painting too expensive to touch. Savannah arrived in a dark green silk dress Grant once said made her look like old New York Grace. She wore it because she still believed that if she stood beside her husband with enough calm, enough dignity, the strange shift in their lives might still correct itself. For most of the evening, she played her role perfectly. She greeted investors, asked about their children, remembered anniversaries, and smoothed over an awkward moment when one donor complained about the seating arrangement. Grant was charming when people were watching. He touched her back lightly, refilled her water, introduced her as the heart of everything we do. Anyone looking from across the room would have seen a powerful husband honoring his wife. But Savannah had started to understand the cruelty of performance. Near the end of the evening, she stepped away from the table and walked toward the terrace corridor to take a breath. The hallway was quiet, dimmer than the dining room, softened by gold wall sconces and the distant sound of glasses clinking behind her. That was when she heard Camille's voice. She was speaking to a society editor from a glossy Manhattan magazine. Camille laughed softly before saying, "Some women are graceful enough to step aside when the room changes. Others make everyone uncomfortable by pretending nothing has." Savannah stopped cold. The editor gave a low, knowing hum. "And does the room change often?" "In this city?" Camille replied. "Only when the right woman finally understands it." The words were smooth, almost elegant. No names, no vulgarity, nothing crude enough to confront without sounding insecure. That was what made them vicious. Savannah turned and found Grant standing just a few feet away at the end of the corridor. He had heard every word. For one fragile second, she waited for him to say something, to correct it, to defend her, to remind the world that she was his wife, not a faded guest overstaying her invitation. Instead, Grant adjusted his cuff, glanced toward the dining room, and said quietly, "Let's not create a scene tonight." That sentence broke something deeper than anger. On the drive back uptown, the city lights blurred past the window like a life moving away from her. Grant checked messages on his iPhone. Savannah sat beside him in silence, staring at her own reflection in the glass. And for the first time, she no longer felt replaced. She felt publicly abandoned. By morning, a society blog had posted a photo of Grant and Camille laughing together, with Savannah cropped out completely. After the River Cafe, Savannah stopped believing in accidents. The insult in the hallway had been too polished. The cropped photo on the society blog had gone live too quickly, and the silence from Grant had told her something far more dangerous than an affair might have. It told her someone was rearranging her life in plain sight, and her husband was letting it happen. 3 days later, Savannah sat alone in the Foundation's private library, her father's old Mont Blanc pen beside an untouched cup of coffee. Morning light spilled across the long oak table as she opened her MacBook and began reviewing internal schedules, donor correspondence, and expenditure summaries from the last 2 quarters. At first, the irregularities looked harmless: a car service billed under outreach, a hotel suite coded as donor relations, a luxury styling invoice buried beneath gala preparation costs. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, it felt wrong. Savannah kept reading. Several invitation chains had been rerouted away from her personal address and forwarded directly to Camille. Board briefing packets had been revised without her approval. 2 long-standing donors she personally cultivated had suddenly begun addressing Camille in emails as if she had always been their contact. Savannah opened one message twice, staring at the line that made her chest tighten. "Thank you, Camille, for clarifying that Savannah is stepping back for personal reasons." Savannah never wrote that, never said it, never authorized anyone to imply it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Judith Holloway stepped inside, carrying a leather folder pressed tight against her side. At 61, Judith had the kind of composure that made younger people nervous, and for the first time since Savannah had known her, she looked unsettled. "You've seen it too," Judith said quietly. Savannah nodded. "How long?" Judith hesitated. Long enough to know this wasn't spontaneous. She placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed expense reports, guest list changes, and handwritten notes from staff too afraid to speak openly. One line had been circled in red. Camille requested all future donor communication be approved through Grant's office only. Savannah's fingers curled against the paper. "This isn't just proximity," she whispered. "This is coordination." Judith met her eyes. "There's more." From the back of the folder, she slid out a copy of a seating chart for the springboard reception. Savannah's usual chair had been reassigned weeks earlier, not by mistake, not by staff confusion, by executive instruction. And the signature at the bottom was Grant's. For the first time, Savannah understood the betrayal was larger than the mistress. Savannah still went ahead with the anniversary dinner. By then, some wounded part of her already knew how the night might end. But hope is stubborn when it has spent years building a home inside a woman's heart. She told herself this dinner was not about saving appearances. It was about giving the truth one final chance to show itself clearly. The penthouse looked beautiful that evening. Candlelight softened the sharp edges of the marble and glass. The city beyond the windows shimmered over Central Park like a promise too far away to touch. Savannah had changed into a midnight blue dress Grant once said was his favorite. She set the table herself, placed white roses in a crystal vase, and asked the chef to leave early so the night would feel private. On the sideboard waited a bottle of wine they had saved from their 5th anniversary trip to Napa. 7 o'clock came and went. At 7:30, Grant texted, "Running late. Start without me." At 8:15 she called. No answer. By 9 the food had gone cold. Savannah sat alone at the long dining table, listening to the soft hum of the city and the louder sound of her own thoughts. She remembered another anniversary years earlier in a tiny apartment downtown, when Grant had brought home grocery store flowers and cheap pasta, apologizing because he could not yet give her more. She had loved him fiercely then, not because of what he had, but because of how carefully he had once held her heart. At 11:42 p.m. her phone lit up. Unknown number. Her breath caught before she even opened it. The message contained only a photo. Grant, unmistakable in his black coat, stepping through a private side entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. Camille beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm. The angle was intimate enough to tell the story without proving a thing. That was the cruelty of it. Whoever sent it knew exactly how to wound, without leaving anything Savannah could fight in public. The room tilted. A sharp pain twisted low in her abdomen. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing hard, waiting for it to pass. It didn't. Another wave hit, hotter, deeper. Panic rose through her chest. She had told almost no one she was pregnant again. Not yet. Not after the first fragile weeks. Not while her marriage already felt like cracked glass under pressure. By midnight, Savannah was alone in the back seat of a car racing downtown, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other clutching her silent phone. Grant never called back. When the doctor stepped into her hospital room before dawn, Savannah knew her marriage had not been the only thing she lost that night. The hospital room was quiet in the cruelest way, not peaceful, not gentle, just empty, white, and far too clean for the kind of grief sitting inside Savannah's chest. Morning light pressed weakly through the window, turning everything pale. A paper bracelet circled her wrist. Her phone lay on the bedside table, dark and silent, as if the world outside had already decided to move on without asking what that night had cost her. The doctor had spoken softly. The nurse had touched her shoulder with practiced kindness. They had used careful words, respectful words, but none of them changed the truth. The baby was gone. Savannah lay still beneath the thin hospital blanket, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how a person could feel hollow and crushed at the same time. She had not told Grant yet. Not because she wanted to punish him, but because some private part of her still could not bear the humiliation of saying the words aloud to a man who had not even answered the phone while she was losing everything. By noon, Judith knew. By 2, Grant arrived. He came in wearing yesterday's suit, expensive and immaculate except for the strain around his eyes. In one hand he carried guilt, in the other a pale blue Tiffany bag. Savannah looked at it once and then away. Grant stood beside the bed like a man unsure whether he was entering a funeral or a negotiation. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. Savannah let the silence sit between them. "I didn't know where to reach you," she finally said. That landed harder than any accusation. He stepped closer. "I was in meetings. My phone died. I didn't understand what was happening." "No," she thought. "You didn't understand because you stopped wanting to know." Grant set the Tiffany bag on the chair and rubbed a hand over his mouth. "Savannah, I know this looks terrible." The words made her turn her head. "Looks terrible, not is terrible. Not I failed you, not I left you alone. Looks terrible." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut cleanly through the room. "Our child died while you were with her," Grant flinched. For a moment, real pain crossed his face. But even then, Savannah saw it. The instinct to contain the damage, to manage the language, to keep the collapse from becoming public. "I never meant for this," he said. Savannah's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "That's the problem, Grant. You never mean for any of it. You just let it happen." He had no answer, and when he finally reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. She simply didn't reach back. As Grant stood there in silence, Savannah realized grief had done what love never could. It had finally removed every illusion she still had about her husband. Savannah did not go home after the hospital. She returned to the penthouse only once, 3 days later, while Grant was at the office and the staff had been instructed to give her privacy. The apartment felt unfamiliar now, too polished, too quiet, as if grief itself had been absorbed into the stone floors and expensive walls. She walked through the rooms slowly, one hand wrapped around a cup of untouched tea, trying to decide what still belonged to her besides memory. In Grant's study, the curtains were half open, letting in a grey Manhattan afternoon. His desk was unusually cluttered, financial packets, donor folders, a silver letter opener. Savannah had not come looking for answers, but pain sharpens instincts, and something in the room felt disturbed, out of place. Then she saw it. A folder, stamped with foundation correspondence, had been left half open beside a stack of investment summaries. She should have walked away. Instead, she sat down and began reading. At first, the material looked routine: draft talking points, donor seating plans, revised sponsorship language. Then a familiar name stopped her cold: Preston Wren. Grant's cousin had always been tolerated, never trusted. Charming in public, reckless in private, forever chasing fast money and cleaner reputations than he deserved. Savannah knew he had lost heavily in a series of failed real estate bets the year before, but Grant insisted family complications had nothing to do with the foundation. Now Preston's name appeared in email chains linked to event approvals, donor access, and outside media consultants, and Camille was copied on all of it. Savannah kept reading, pulse rising. One message from Preston to Camille was short, almost careless. If Savannah steps back completely, the board won't fight the transition. Grant just needs time. Transition. Another read: once her side loses visibility, the trust influence weakens. Savannah stared at that line until the words blurred. Her side. Not her feelings, not her marriage. Her side. This was bigger than an affair. Camille had not simply drifted toward Grant out of attraction or vanity. She had been useful, positioned, encouraged, and Preston, desperate, indebted, and greedy, had seen Savannah not as family, not as a wife, not even as a grieving woman, but as an obstacle, standing between him and the moneyed influence attached to the foundation. For the first time, the full shape of her ruin began to emerge. She wasn't being replaced only in Grant's heart. She was being removed from a system. Savannah closed the folder with trembling hands, just as her phone buzzed with a message from Judith. "We need to talk. There's something about the board vote you were never meant to see." And in that moment, Savannah understood Camille was not the architect of the betrayal, just the most visible weapon. Judith did not ask Savannah to come to the foundation office. Instead, she sent a car to a quiet townhouse on the Upper East Side that had once belonged to Savannah's aunt, a place almost no one in Grant's world ever mentioned. The curtains were drawn against the late afternoon light. A fire burned low in the sitting room. On the coffee table sat a leather folder, a legal pad, and 2 untouched cups of tea that had long since gone cold. Judith was not alone. A man stood near the mantel, tall, composed, wearing a charcoal coat over a navy suit. Nathan Cole. Savannah recognized him instantly, though it had been years. He had been 1 year ahead of her at Columbia, sharp-minded and impossible to impress. Now he was one of the city's most discreet attorneys, the kind wealthy families called when they wanted a disaster contained before it became front-page history. Nathan's expression softened when he saw her. "Savannah." She nodded once. Judith said this couldn't wait. "It can't," Judith replied. Savannah sat, every muscle in her body still tight from the discovery in Grant's study. Judith opened the folder and slid several printed pages across the table. Internal board memos, proxy discussions, a draft resolution never sent to her. At the top of the final page was language so polished it almost hid its cruelty. In light of Mrs. Wren's emotional retreat from public responsibilities, interim representation should be reassigned for continuity and donor confidence. Savannah read it twice. "They were preparing to sideline me formally," she said. Nathan stepped forward. "Not just sideline you, redefine your absence as incapacity." Something icy moved through her chest. Judith handed over one more page. It was a media brief prepared for select society contacts, suggested phrases, delicate ones. "Savannah is focusing on healing. Savannah has chosen privacy. Savannah is no longer involved in operational strategy." "She never chose any of this," Judith said sharply. Nathan crouched slightly, meeting Savannah at eye level. "This is coordinated. Preston opened access. Camille shaped perception. Grant may not have built the plan, but he allowed the conditions that made it possible." Savannah looked down at the papers in her lap. Weeks ago, those phrases might have crushed her. Now they clarified something. They were not describing her pain. They were weaponizing it. Nathan's voice lowered. "They're counting on your silence because silence looks graceful on women like you." Savannah lifted her eyes. "And what if I stop being graceful?" she asked. For the first time that day, Nathan gave a faint, humorless smile. "Then they'll finally have a real problem." Judith reached into the folder again and placed one final document on the table. The board vote schedule for the night Savannah had miscarried. Savannah left Manhattan before sunrise. She did not tell Grant. She did not leave a note. By the time the city woke and black SUVs began gliding down Park Avenue, she was already miles north, watching the skyline shrink in the rear window like a life that had learned how to continue without her. Beside her sat one overnight bag, a wool coat, and the leather folder Judith had placed in her hands the night before. It felt strangely light for something carrying the outline of a betrayal this large. The house in Hudson Valley belonged to her late aunt, a quiet stone property tucked behind bare winter trees and a long gravel drive. There was no staff, no photographers, no polished doorman who knew how to look away at the right moment. Only silence, frost, silvering the windows, and the kind of stillness that forces grief to stop performing and speak honestly. For the first 2 days, Savannah barely left the bedroom. She slept in fragments, cried only when the house was too dark to judge her, ate because Judith called and insisted. At night, memories came in cruel little flashes, Grant laughing softly into his phone, the photo at the Ritz-Carlton, the doctor's careful voice, the Tiffany bag on the hospital chair like a final insult wrapped in blue ribbon. Every loss seemed connected now, stitched into one long season of being diminished. And still the worst part was not knowing whether Grant had ever really seen what was happening. On the third morning, Savannah walked downstairs in thick socks and a borrowed sweater and found a stack of packages by the front door. Soup from Judith. Legal copies from Nathan. A Kindle loaded with books she used to love but had not touched in years. No message from Grant. She stared at that absence longer than she meant to. By noon, society blogs were already rewriting her disappearance. One headline called her retreat a graceful withdrawal from public life. Another praised Camille's poise under pressure, as if Savannah's entire marriage had simply become a vacancy someone prettier had filled well. Savannah sat by the fire, reading the words until her face went cold. That was when something changed. For weeks, she had been thinking like a wounded wife, a grieving woman, someone struggling to survive humiliation with dignity. But the headlines made one thing brutally clear. If she stayed hidden much longer, the lie would harden into history. She was not watching her life fall apart anymore. She was watching it being rewritten. And somewhere in Manhattan, people were already toasting the woman who had taken her place, while Savannah was still learning how to breathe through the loss of her child. When Nathan arrived that evening with a sealed trust document, Savannah finally understood why Preston had wanted her out so badly. Nathan arrived just after sunset, carrying a sealed document case and the kind of expression that told Savannah he was about to confirm something ugly. Outside, Hudson Valley had gone dark beneath a veil of winter blue. Inside, the fire cast soft light across the stone walls, warming the room without touching the chill that had settled into her since Manhattan began rewriting her life. Savannah stood when he entered, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. "What is it?" Nathan set the case on the dining table and opened it carefully. "The reason Preston was so determined to remove you." Inside were trust documents, old correspondence, and a chain of legal amendments tied to the Foundation's earliest funding. Savannah sat slowly, her heartbeat suddenly loud in the quiet room. Nathan slid the top page toward her. "The public thinks the Foundation was built under Grant's philanthropic vision. That's the version they've sold for years. But the legal core of it, the sustaining trust, the emergency endowment, the long-term donor protections, came through your family." Savannah stared at the name on the page, Pierce Family Charitable Trust. For a moment she could only hear her aunt's voice from years ago, saying that real generosity should never depend on applause. Savannah had known her family helped in the beginning. She had not known how deeply the Foundation's survival still depended on that structure. Nathan continued. "If you had been fully pushed out, Preston would have had room to redirect influence, reshape oversight, and gradually weaken the Pierce protections, not immediately, quietly, over time." Savannah looked up. "And Camille?" "She may have started as ambition wrapped in charm," Nathan said, "but by the time Preston saw what her proximity to Grant could do, she became useful." Judith, seated beside the fire, spoke at last. "That's why they didn't just want distance between you and Grant. They needed you to look unstable, absent, irrelevant. Once the room believed that, they could take everything that was yours without ever calling it theft." Savannah lowered her eyes to the trust papers in her hands. Her grief was still there. So was the humiliation. But now, beneath both, something harder began to form. This had never been only about a marriage collapsing under betrayal. It was about legacy. It was about power disguised as concern. It was about men and women deciding she was easier to erase than confront. Nathan placed one final paper in front of her, an emergency clause requiring her signature for any structural change to the trust-backed branches of the Foundation. And suddenly, Savannah understood the one thing no one in Manhattan knew yet. They had spent months trying to push her out, but they still needed her to complete the takeover. Savannah looked up from the documents and said the first dangerous words she had spoken in months. "And let them keep underestimating me. The next step was not dramatic. That was exactly why it mattered. Savannah did not rush back to Manhattan in anger. She did not call Grant in tears. She did not threaten Camille, confront Preston, or leak anything to the press. Instead, 3 days later, she put on a camel wool coat, tied her hair back, and returned to the city for a series of quiet meetings. No gossip columnist would have noticed. The first was at the Lowell, in a private tea room tucked far from the louder corners of the Upper East Side. Judith had arranged it carefully. No public list, no foundation branding, no dramatic reveal. Just Savannah, a linen notebook, and 3 long-standing donors who had once trusted her before the room around her changed. They greeted her with the awkward kindness people use when they are not sure whether a woman has been ruined or merely wounded. Savannah made that uncertainty disappear quickly. She did not speak about Grant first. She did not mention Camille. She did not describe the humiliation, the hospital, or the headlines. Instead, she asked a simple question. Do you remember who called St. Bartholomew's at 2 in the morning when the children's wing lost emergency funding? The oldest donor, Eleanor Bishop, blinked. You did? Savannah nodded. Do you remember who rewrote the Winter Grant program after the shelter fire in Queens? A second donor answered more softly. You. And who stayed with the Morales family after the press left? This time, none of them needed to answer. They remembered. That was the thing about truth. It could be buried under glamour for a while, but people who had witnessed real character rarely forgot it forever. Savannah spoke for nearly an hour, calm and precise. She laid out concerns about governance, donor access, and the subtle misuse of the Foundation's image. She did not overstate a single point. She did not ask for pity. She asked only for memory, integrity, and patience while the full picture emerged. By the time tea had gone cold, the mood in the room had changed. The uncertainty was gone. So was the quiet distance people had begun placing between themselves and her. When Eleanor reached across the table and touched Savannah's hand, her voice trembled with something close to shame. We should have asked more questions when you disappeared. Savannah held her gaze. You're asking them now? Outside, Madison Avenue moved on as always, polished and indifferent. But inside that small room, the first real shift had begun, not in headlines, not in court, in memory. And memory, Savannah knew, was the one thing Camille had never truly earned. That evening, one donor cancelled her private lunch with Camille and requested an immediate meeting with Savannah instead. The woman who came to Savannah that week did not arrive as a friend. She arrived as a witness. Elise Rowan had built her career in Manhattan by knowing exactly which photographs deserved ink and which silences deserved money. She wrote for one of the city's sleekest society publications, the kind that made and ruined reputations in the same issue. For months, her pages had helped polish Camille Mercer into something elegant, sympathetic, almost inevitable. That was why Savannah nearly refused to meet her. But Judith insisted. If Elise asked for privacy, she said, then she's afraid of something. So Savannah agreed to see her at a quiet hotel lounge just off Madison Avenue, where the lighting was low, the coffee was overpriced, and no one important ever looked directly at another table. Elise arrived in a cream coat, sunglasses still on despite the dim room, her expression composed in that brittle way people look when they know they are no longer fully in control. I won't insult you with fake sympathy, Elise said after sitting down. You've had enough of that. Savannah said nothing. Elise set her phone on the table but kept one hand over it. Camille used me. At first I thought she was just ambitious, smart, strategic, nothing unusual for this city. But 3 weeks ago at a dinner downtown, she said something I haven't been able to forget. Savannah's gaze sharpened. Elise inhaled once. She was tipsy, and Preston was there. They were laughing. Camille said, and I wrote it down the moment I got home, "I'm not trying to be loved. I'm trying to become untouchable in rooms where money decides memory." The words landed cold. For a moment, Savannah felt nothing at all. Then the full meaning sank in. Camille had never wanted Grant as a man. She wanted what standing beside him created: access, legitimacy, protection, a rewritten history with herself at the center. Elise finally lifted her hand from the phone. I recorded part of the conversation after that, not the first sentence, but enough to tie Camille and Preston together. Savannah looked at the device, then at Elise. "Why bring this to me now?" Elise's laugh was small and bitter. "Because yesterday, Camille asked me to prepare a feature calling her The Foundation's Natural Next Chapter. And for the first time in my life, even I couldn't make the lie sound elegant." Savannah reached for the phone slowly. Across the lounge, mirrors reflected candlelight and polished faces, but at her table, the atmosphere had changed completely. This was no longer suspicion. It was evidence. When Savannah pressed play, Preston's voice came through the speaker first, and what followed would destroy far more than Camille's image. By the time the winter charity ball approached, Camille believed she had already won. Manhattan had begun treating her like a woman whose future was simply waiting to be announced. Her photo appeared beside Grant's in donor recaps, gala previews, and one especially flattering feature that described her as a modern force in philanthropic branding. She accepted every compliment with perfect restraint, as though attention embarrassed her, when in truth she fed on it. By then she was no longer trying to enter Savannah's world. She was decorating herself with its remains. Grant, however, had started to change. It was subtle at first, a hesitation in his replies, a sharpness when Camille pushed too hard, questions about expense approvals she once could have laughed away. 2 nights before the ball, he discovered that a media consulting invoice tied to the foundation had been routed through a shell company with Preston's fingerprints all over it. When he confronted Camille privately, she did what women like her always do when cornered too early. She cried with precision. She told Grant he was exhausted, suspicious, manipulated by grief, by gossip, by people who wanted to turn him against the one person still standing beside him. Then she stepped closer, touched his arm, and lowered her voice. "Show up with me at the ball," she said. "Smile, let them see stability. Once the room settles, everything else will quiet down." Grant didn't answer immediately. That silence frightened her more than anger would have. So Camille raised the stakes. She reminded him how ugly public uncertainty could become, how investors hated whispers, how donors pulled back when men in power looked emotionally compromised. She even implied that Savannah's sudden reappearance in private donor circles was proof she meant to embarrass him publicly. That part worked. Grant still cared too much about control to ignore the threat of spectacle. So on the night of the ball, he arrived with Camille on his arm. The plaza glowed beneath winter light, and rows of black cars lined Fifth Avenue. Inside, photographers called Camille's name as if they had rehearsed it. She wore deep crimson this time, not silver, a bolder shade, more possessive. At her throat glittered diamonds chosen to be noticed. Grant stood beside her in perfect black tie, expression unreadable, but those who knew him well could already see the cracks under the polish. Camille saw them too. That was why, the moment she stepped into the ballroom, she made a decision. If Savannah appeared tonight, She would not simply endure her, she would humiliate her first. And across the city, Savannah was fastening a single black earring, already knowing Camille's next move before she made it. Grant came to Savannah the night before the charity ball. He did not warn her. He simply appeared at the townhouse on the Upper East Side a little after 9, while the city outside glowed cold beneath winter rain. The butler had long since retired for the evening, and Savannah herself opened the door. For a brief, strange second, they only looked at each other. Grant seemed older, not weaker, not broken, just worn in a way expensive suits and perfect posture could no longer hide. Rain darkened the shoulders of his overcoat. His jaw was tight, his eyes carrying the sleepless strain of a man who had finally begun to understand the cost of waiting too long. "May I come in?" he asked. Savannah stepped aside without answering. The sitting room was warm, lit by the soft, amber glow of 2 lamps and the low fire burning in the grate. A tray with untouched tea sat on the table beside a stack of legal folders. Grant noticed them immediately. Of course he did. He had spent his entire life recognizing threats disguised as quiet objects. He removed his gloves slowly. "You've been meeting donors?" "Yes." "With Nathan Cole?" "Yes." Grant exhaled through his nose, a restrained flash of frustration crossing his face. "Savannah, whatever you think is happening, this can still be handled privately." There it was, not grief, not remorse, management. Savannah stood beside the mantel, one hand resting lightly on the marble edge. "Handled for whom?" "For everyone," he said. "For the foundation, for the board, for you." She almost smiled. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you stay quiet tomorrow, I can protect your position, your financial security, the townhouse, the foundation title. We can restructure this without destroying everything in public." Savannah looked at him steadily, and for the first time Grant seemed to realize how completely he had lost the right to bargain with her. "You still think this is about what you can give me?" she said. His expression flickered. "I'm trying to prevent a scandal." "No," Savannah replied softly. "You're trying to prevent consequences." The fire shifted behind her, casting brief gold light across her face. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, words did not come fast enough to save him. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. "Do you hate me?" Savannah held his gaze for a long moment. "No," she said. "That would require me to still carry you." The answer landed harder than anger ever could. Grant stood there, stripped of every defense except silence, while the woman he once assumed would remain his no matter what, now looked at him like a chapter already finished. As Grant turned to leave, Savannah gave him one final warning. "Tomorrow night, I'm not coming back for you. I'm coming back for my name." When Savannah entered the ballroom at the plaza, the air changed before the room did. That was the power of a woman people believed had disappeared for good. At first, only a few heads turned. Then whispers traveled table to table like a current beneath silk gowns and black tuxedos. The chandeliers burned above them, the string quartet continued playing, and servers moved between silver trays of champagne as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. Camille saw Savannah almost immediately. For 1 second, real panic flickered across her face. Then training took over. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and arranged herself into the soft smile she used whenever she wanted to wound someone beautifully. Grant, standing beside her, did not move at all. Savannah crossed the room in black, elegant, and severe, wearing no diamonds except the small earrings that caught the light when she turned her head. She looked less like a disgraced wife returning to society and more like the only honest thing in a room built on presentation. Camille stepped forward first. "How brave of you to come," she said, her tone warm enough to fool strangers. "I know crowded rooms can feel overwhelming after everything." A few nearby guests went still. Savannah met her gaze calmly. "You mean after grief or after theft? It's helpful when people are specific." Camille's smile tightened, but she recovered quickly. "I only meant that tonight is important for the foundation. I'd hate for emotions to distract from the cause." Savannah let the silence stretch just long enough to make the words embarrass Camille instead of herself. Then she asked quietly, "Which pediatric partner is receiving the emergency winter allocation this quarter?" Camille blinked. "The Children's Initiative," Savannah added. "You spoke about it in the donor preview." "Yes, of course," Camille said smoothly. "Mount—" She stopped. It was the wrong hospital. Savannah did not rescue her. "And the amount?" Camille gave a number that was not only inaccurate, but nearly double the real figure. Two board members exchanged startled glances. A donor near the champagne tower slowly lowered his glass. Savannah tilted her head slightly. Interesting, because anyone actually involved would know the allocation was redirected after the oncology transport grant was expanded. Camille's color shifted. Across the room, Grant closed his eyes for the briefest moment. The performance was cracking now, and everyone close enough could hear it. Camille forced a laugh. "Well, details move quickly behind the scenes." Savannah's voice remained soft, almost gentle. "Not when you're the one who built them." The words landed like a slap. And for the first time all night, people stopped looking at Camille like a rising star. They started looking at her like an intruder. Then the master of ceremonies walked toward the stage, lifted the microphone, and announced it was time to honor the true founding force behind the foundation. For half a second, Camille moved. It was instinct, not permission. The master of ceremonies had barely finished the phrase "true founding force" when she shifted her weight toward the stage, the kind of polished reflex built from months of borrowed attention. But then the ballroom screens came alive. The first image was old. Savannah in a wool coat outside St. Bartholomew's, holding a folder against her chest, her hair blown loose by winter wind. The second showed her seated on the floor of a pediatric wing, listening to a mother speak while a little boy slept nearby. The third was from years earlier, Savannah standing beside a much younger Grant at a folding table during the Foundation's first fundraising breakfast. No diamonds, no press wall, no polished branding. Just work. The room went silent, not polite silence, shocked silence. Camille stopped moving. Judith stood near the stage steps, one hand resting lightly on the railing, her posture calm and exact. Nathan remained several feet behind her, holding a slim black folder. Grant did not turn toward either of them. He was staring at the screen with the expression of a man being forced to watch the truth arrive in public before he had decided how to manage it. Then the MC spoke again. "Tonight, we honor the woman whose vision, labor, and family trust sustained this foundation long before the cameras cared to learn her name, Ms. Savannah Pierce." Savannah stepped forward. There was no rush in her movement, no tremor, no visible need to savor the moment. That restraint made the entire scene more devastating. She was not claiming someone else's spotlight. She was taking back her own. Before she reached the stage, Nathan opened the folder and handed a copy of several documents to two board members and one major donor: trust records, internal directives, expense routes, a transcript excerpt from Elise's recording. Judith quietly gave another packet to the chairwoman of donor oversight. Camille found her voice first. "This is absurd." It came out too sharp. Nathan turned toward her. "Is it absurd that you misrepresented your role? Or that you coordinated access with Preston Wren while presenting yourself as the Foundation's natural successor?" A murmur spread through the ballroom. Camille looked to Grant, expecting rescue. He said nothing. Savannah took the microphone and let the silence settle before speaking. "Charity is not a costume," she said, "and compassion is not a ladder." The words hit harder than any scream could have. From across the room, Camille's expression finally cracked. Not into guilt, into fear. Because for the first time all year she understood the room no longer belonged to her. Then one donor stood and began to applaud, and within seconds the entire ballroom rose with him. The fallout began before the music stopped. Even as the applause continued around Savannah, people were no longer clapping only for her. They were distancing themselves from Camille. In rooms like this, reputation never collapsed loudly at first. It shifted in posture, in eye contact, in who chose not to cross the floor to save you. Camille felt it immediately. A donor she had been charming all season turned away when she stepped closer. A board member refused to take the explanation she was already trying to offer. One of the younger photographers lowered his camera instead of rushing in for a damage control shot. The ballroom that had welcomed her only an hour earlier now looked at her like a woman who had entered under false pretenses. Grant finally moved, but too late to change anything. He crossed the floor towards Savannah just as the donor oversight chair asked him, in a voice far too calm to be merciful, to join a private discussion upstairs. Nathan was already handing over additional copies of the records. Judith stood beside Savannah, steady and unreadable, while several long-time donors began speaking to her directly, almost urgently, as if trying to repair in minutes what they had failed to protect for months. Camille looked for Preston. He was gone. Of course he was. Men like Preston always disappeared first, leaving women like Camille to stand in the wreckage wearing the ambition they once thought looked glamorous. She reached for her phone, but notifications were already flooding the screen. A scheduled society feature had been pulled. A luncheon invitation for the following week was suddenly postponed. A luxury host committee she had bragged about joining sent a short, brutal message. "In light of tonight's developments, we are withdrawing your participation." No scandal had even reached the papers yet. But Manhattan had already decided. Upstairs, Grant was informed that until the review was complete, he would step back from several ceremonial leadership roles tied to the Foundation. Publicly, it would be framed as cooperation. Privately, everyone in that room understood it for what it was: consequence. When he came back down, Savannah was standing near the ballroom doors, ready to leave. He stopped in front of her, eyes hollow with the kind of shock money could not fix. "Savannah." She met his gaze, calm and distant. "I told you," she said. "I came back for my name." Then she walked past him and into the winter air, while behind her Camille remained trapped beneath the chandeliers she had mistaken for a crown. By morning, Camille would lose more than her place in the ballroom. She would lose every door that money had only borrowed for her. 3 months after the charity ball, Manhattan had moved on in the way powerful cities always do, quickly, elegantly, and without apology. But for Savannah Pierce, the silence that followed was no longer cruel. It was peaceful. Spring had softened the city by then. Central Park was green again, and the foundation she had rebuilt now carried a revised name, one that honored its true origins without borrowing anyone else's glory. The governance board had been restructured, donor protections were restored, Judith oversaw operations with quiet authority, and every new initiative required the transparency Savannah had fought to bring back. The work felt cleaner now, smaller in ego, bigger in truth. Grant Wren remained wealthy, respected in certain business circles, and photographed when necessary. But something essential had left him. He had kept the towers, the deals, the tailored suits, the black cars waiting outside polished buildings. What he had lost was harder to replace. The one person who had believed in him before success made him unbearable was gone, and no amount of damage control could return her. Camille's fall had been swifter. The invitations vanished first, then the profiles, then the careful little friendships she had built in rooms where status mattered more than loyalty. By the end of the season, her name no longer opened doors. Preston, facing private legal pressure and public disgrace, had disappeared to Miami with what remained of his credibility. For both of them, the punishment was fitting. They had tried to build their future on deception, and deception collapsed exactly the way it deserved to. Savannah never celebrated any of it out loud. Her victory was too deep for that. On a bright Saturday afternoon, she stood in a small scholarship event at the conservatory garden, speaking with students and their families beneath soft sunlight and early blooms. No chandeliers, no cameras fighting for position, no women performing kindness in couture gowns, just real people, real gratitude, and the steady warmth of a life no longer built on fear. Nathan Cole stood nearby, sleeves rolled, helping move chairs after the event ended. When Savannah turned toward him, he smiled with the ease of a man who had never needed her to become smaller in order to feel strong. Later, as the garden emptied and the city hummed gently beyond its gates, he reached for her hand. This time, Savannah reached back. She had not been rewarded with fantasy. She had been given something better, her name, her dignity, her work. And at last, a love that did not ask her to disappear in order to deserve it. And as Savannah walked forward into the life she had reclaimed, the city that once erased her finally had no choice but to remember her. And just like that, the story comes to a close, my wonderful friends. If you're still here with me at this moment, then maybe something in Savannah's journey has touched your heart in a very personal way. And maybe now, together, we can look at this story from a deeper angle. Sometimes the greatest loss in life is not money, status, or even love. It is losing yourself while trying to keep peace with people who no longer value your heart. This story reminds us that silence can be graceful, but silence should never become surrender. As the Stoics taught, we cannot control the choices of others, but we can control our response. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we have power over our mind, not outside events, and that truth alone can begin healing. Savannah did not heal by revenge alone. She healed by remembering who she was, standing in truth, and refusing to trade her dignity for temporary comfort. That is a lesson all of us can carry into real life. If this story stayed with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And before you go, tell me in the comments what part of Savannah's journey felt most real to you. This story is a fictional dramatic narrative created for storytelling and emotional reflection. It is not presented as real news, a documentary, or a factual report about any real person, company, hotel, or public event. Names, characters, situations, and settings are used as creative elements to explore themes such as dignity, betrayal, healing, personal growth, and accountability. Any resemblance to actual people or real-life events is purely coincidental. The purpose of this content is entertainment, inspiration, and discussion, not deception or misinformation. Viewers are encouraged to receive it as a work of fiction designed in a cinematic style for YouTube storytelling. At its heart, the story focuses on emotional truth rather than literal fact, showing how self-respect, inner strength, and wise choices can help a person rebuild life after deep pain. This content does not intend to mislead, defame, or misrepresent any real individual or organization.